And we are live. Good evening, folks. This is the Protestant line number 7. I don't have number 7 on my thing. Let's show this anyway. And we have Dr. Kevin Clauson with us from Bryan College this evening. Zach's not able to be with us. For those that normally see Zach, he has some technical issues he's got to take care of at home. I told him to pop in on Facebook and ask questions. Anybody else, if you're on Facebook, you can ask questions. We'll stump the professor tonight if we can and see what happens. I have known Dr. Clauson since 2004, which you might not remember, but it was 2004 when I first met you at Grace Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Lynchburg, Virginia, in the basement of a house before we acquired the building. So that is 16 years now that we have known one another.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you coming on. So why don't you tell the folks a little bit about who you are, what you do, and why you're credentialed to speak to the issues we'll be talking about tonight.
Well, that means I'm 16 years older, by the way, too.
Yeah, we both are.
You know. Well, most recently, I've been a professor of government and also served for over 4 years as vice president of academics at Bryan College. Before that, I served as president of Christ College. Before that, and sometimes contemporaneously with that, I served as the head of the government program at Liberty University. Before that, I taught at Grove City College in Pennsylvania. So I've been in the academic world for close to 40 years now, which really makes me feel old.
Well, you're getting close to retirement age, yeah?
I am very close, dangerously close.
And so what are your degrees in your studies before becoming a professor?
Yeah, starting with the highest one, I have a Doctor of Jurisprudence degree from West Virginia University. That's a Doctor of Laws degree. Master of Arts degree in Political Science from Marshall University. You know, We Are Marshall. The movie, We Are Marshall.
That's right. That's right.
And, a Bachelor of Arts degree and a Bachelor of Science degree. Bachelor of Arts in International Affairs, Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from Marshall University. Huntington, West Virginia, where Marshall is located, was my hometown. So that's why I have so many degrees from Marshall. It was cheap and easy.
And when did you meet your wife and all of that?
Well, let's see. I met my wife when she was at Marshall, and she came to my home church, which was just a couple blocks away from Marshall. And I was in town away from the law school for a weekend, and that's where I first met her. And I told my brother, my twin brother, that that's the girl I'm going to marry. And sure enough, the Lord allowed that. And that was 38 years ago that we were married. 38 years ago, this past Friday. And we have 5 children and 11 grandchildren now.
Wow.
Spread around.
How's that going for you?
Well, we enjoy when they come and visit.
Yeah.
But, you know, they don't stay a long time.
Sure.
But we really enjoy their visits. And we still have 2 at home. The oldest, who is handicapped. And then the youngest, who is about to turn 15. And so those 2 are still at home and everybody else is away.
Right. And so your specialties, I looked at the website earlier, but I should pull it up, but I haven't done it. What are your considered specialties within government, the instructions, government and law, correct?
Yeah. Constitutional law, philosophy of law, jurisprudence is what it's usually called, jurisprudence. Political economy, which is the confluence of economics and public policy, and public administration.
And I think it's got Oliver Cromwell listed as
I
well.
was about to mention that. That's kind of a little sidebar. I have immersed myself over the years in the life and times of Oliver Cromwell.
Yeah.
I have come to the conclusion that he is much misunderstood and maligned, unjustly maligned.
And we won't
Like
go
to
ahead.
think of Cromwell as a dictator,
Right.
and if you look at his life in politics and in the British military, he really didn't have any desire to be anything like what we would call a military. He wanted parliamentary government, even when he didn't like the parliaments and dissolved them, which he did on several occasions. He always called for new elections. He may have been too much of a perfectionist. He was trying to get the perfect parliament, which never happened. But he always called for new elections for the parliament. He wanted parliamentary government.
Yeah.
The only time, really, when he was Lord Protector, it was really the only time in British history when they had a true executive authority and legislative authority at the same time.
And he had at least a couple of famous chaplains too. Is that correct? Who were some of his? Do you remember who some of his chaplains
Well,
were?
John Owens for one.
Yeah.
Um, Hugh Peter was another.
Yeah, there's one I'm not thinking of. John Owen, and there's one other that I can't think of.
Yeah, he was a true Puritan. He really was a godly man.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean he was perfect. Doesn't mean he didn't make mistakes, but he was quite a leader when the British needed a leader.
Is there any way to relate his time to ours? You think? Can you make any correlations? We don't have to get into it too deeply right now, but
There are always I think some possibilities like that.
sure.
He had to contend with well, for example, he had to contend with a lot of unrest. The Royalists were constantly trying to start up the Civil War again, cause trouble, foment trouble, and he was always having to try to deal with that. And he dealt with it in a way which he tried to conciliate. He tried to have a degree of conciliation with the Royalists, though he was a Puritan. He also had to contend with the Independents and the Presbyterians too. The Independents, the Presbyterians, and the Royalists all hated each other, and he was trying to bring all these groups together in a sense to at least keep some peace in the country.
Sure.
And his established church. People don't give Cromwell credit. In one sense, Cromwell was the facilitator of what we would call in this country religious liberty in England, which had a single established church, the Anglican Church, Church of England. He put together a different kind of established church, which really wasn't an established church at all. It was a structure where where the Episcopalians, we call them Episcopalians, the Presbyterians, and the Independents all had freedom and a degree of say in what was going to happen in terms of the church. But at the same time, each of the groups had their own ways of doing things, and he allowed that. The only one church, of course, that nobody really liked back then was the Roman Catholic Church. And a few of the radicals.
Sure. Well, I would say with the bloody conflict that went on, there was some reason for animosity between Protestants and Catholics at that time.
Oh my, yes.
So let's get to talking about what's been happening in our world, and we can't cover everything because 2020 has, been, from murder hornets to coronaviruses. I was trying to think what the next thing was, but so as far as the situation with the lockdowns, again, out here, just so you're aware, we didn't ever have it quite as bad as some other states. I did keep a watch on Tennessee. Of course, I have some relatives in that area, and so I know they had a little bit worse, on the situation. But what is your general take from a constitutional perspective on what has occurred, especially regarding churches and the freedom of religion clause? I'll just say I think what happened at first, just to set this up, what happened at first, and churches weren't actually shut down then, or locked down or limited, whatever they were doing in different states. We needed to be cautious. We didn't know what was going to happen. This thing was out there, and we didn't have enough data or statistics out there. But then, of course, we were allowed to have church when they actually told us out here, hey, we have to start, getting our numbers down. We actually had more data in, and nothing was going on, and it seemed a little bit odd. So, what is your general take, I guess, before I start asking maybe more specific questions?
Yeah. Well, there are two issues involved. If you look at the course of constitutional law in the United States, one obviously is the big one, the free exercise clause of the Constitution. But on the other hand, there's also the issue, and the Supreme Court has said this over and over and over again, usually in response to free speech and freedom of assembly and those sorts of things, not normally in response to the religious liberty clause. But they call it the time, manner, place exceptions. And if you put the two together, what it comes out to is this: the governments on the state level or the federal level, that was originally written to restrict the federal government. That's been applied to the states over time by the Supreme Court. So we'll just assume it applies to the states because we can't change what the Supreme Court said at the moment. But if you put those two together, what you end up with is that governments cannot restrict absolutely the free exercise of religion, but the states can, under certain circumstances, regulate the time, manner, and place of the exercise of those sorts of rights, like the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and so on and so forth. So, for example, if you're going to, we've been talking about protesting, if you're going to protest, generally speaking, you can protest in a public place as long as you don't destroy property. But if you go, let's say, go into a residential neighborhood with a bullhorn at 2 o'clock in the morning and start using your bullhorn to protest something, disturbing the peace of the neighbors and so on and so forth, somebody will call the police. Police will come. They'll tell you to stop. You won't stop. They'll take you in. They'll charge you with disturbing the peace or something like that. And that's legitimate for them to do that. They can't discriminate against you on the basis of your message, but they can to an extent. And the Supreme Court has all kinds of ifs, ands, or buts if they put on this. To an extent, they can regulate, or they have been able to regulate time, manner, and place of the exercise of those various rights in the First Amendment. Now, the problem is, I think, that a lot of states didn't know what they were doing. They were just all over the map. They were telling people who wanted to meet for church, you can't meet for church at all. You can't even have an outdoor service, some governors said. And yet they were letting Walmart stay open. And, whatever. They can't do that. That's not a reasonable time, manner, place restriction because it's not equally applied to all situations. So if they're going to tell a church that they can only have let's say their seating capacity is 100, they can only use 50% of that, then they have to do the same thing for all entities, Walmart and the restaurants and so on and so forth. Now they also have to prove, if somebody brought a lawsuit, a constitutional lawsuit, they also have to prove that that is the least restrictive means and a reasonable means of protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the public, because that's also allowed by the states. Those are the police powers of the states to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens of the state. But they can't.
I want to jump in.
Yeah.
I want to jump in just because here's my dilemma with what you're saying. And again, I don't disagree with the brute facts of what's happened, but it seems to me that, and again, this is where I've been disappointed watching pastors and churches online. It seems to me that I don't care what the government does with regards to what it does to restaurants, Walmart, any other kind of institution. I'm not asking for you to allow me to have freedom of speech, or I'm not asking you to allow me to have freedom of peaceful assembly, because even that peaceful assembly has different connotations. I mean, that was for protests, basically, I would say, right? I mean, that's the underlying idea. Sure. We're meeting because we're a religion, right? And that's our religion, and I don't care what you do to Walmart. I mean, and my response, I mean, I didn't finish the whole thought, but I feel that we are compelled by Scripture to physically meet together on the Lord's Day, and therefore I'm exercising my religion. I think now, again, if the elders of a church want to say, for the benefit of the public, because the government has asked us, we're going to not meet this week, then that's fine. I mean, that's what the elders of the church are allowed to do. But I do feel like we too quickly as churches, and again, many churches aren't even informed in this kind of way. They too quickly just said, the government said, and so they go to this Romans 13 issue, follow the government, which I have a whole other argument about that. But just on a basic level, I'm exercising my religion by having worship on Sunday. What you do to a restaurant, like, because they said, well, they're doing it to everybody. I don't care. They're not, they don't get the freedom of religion clause at Walmart. We get the freedom of religion clause at church. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. You actually, in one sense, you moved from various constitutional arguments for and against,
right?
Sort of been summarizing, to what God says. The thing is that in Scripture, the church is not just another institution. It's not just like another Walmart. It's not just like another doctor's office. It's not, whatever.
Right.
It's a very different kind of institution, established by Christ, established by God. And so the question becomes, from a biblical standpoint, does any governmental authority have the higher authority, the higher power to tell the church you can't meet together as Scripture commands? And there's where we have to, I think, go to Scripture and not to the Constitution. The Constitution tells us where the Supreme Court might draw lines. And they draw lines that might be helpful to us, and they might draw lines that might not be helpful to us. But Scripture tells us something more definite about the church, the nature of the church, the value of the church, the king of the church, and so on and so forth. So it is a different animal that we're talking about than if we talk about religion in the context of constitutional law.
Right. But I still think that, going by the Constitution, it says you have the government shall not infringe upon, the exercise of religion.
Right.
And some churches wouldn't even say that that's part of their, because they're like, well, you can meet on Saturday, or you can meet in the house, or you can, whatever. I think that we're called, and again, as our religion, to meet together on Sundays. Therefore, that idea is protected in the First Amendment under freedom of religion. It's not protected under freedom of assembly or freedom of speech. It's under freedom of religion. And so I guess the way around it for me constitutionally is for them to do some kind of health directive thing, but that gets a little bit murky for me too. I think we agree, but I still want to appeal to the Constitution.
Yeah, I'd like to appeal to the Constitution too, and we may end up having, more. I hate to rely on the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court's been wrong a lot.
Sure,
but we may get more guidance from the Supreme Court on this in due course. They have had to deal occasionally with free exercise of religion, and they've adopted this rule that's it's often called the general applicability rule. The general applicability rule says that if a state or a local government or federal government, whatever, is applying a generally applicable law, let's say generally applicable law is you can't use certain types of drugs, okay, then it doesn't matter if there are people out there who use peyote, let's say, as part of their religious exercises. Doesn't matter. They're not entitled to free exercise of religion because the generally applicable law, which is generally applicable, is not picking on their religion. It's picking on drug use. Okay. Right. And that makes things kind of murky too. What adds to the murkiness is that there's this law that was passed back when Bill Clinton was president, and Bill Clinton supported it and signed it, passed overwhelmingly by Congress. Not sure it would today, but the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which attempted to overturn that general applicability principle.
Right.
Well, that itself was appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court declared part of it constitutional and part of it unconstitutional. So it's these sorts of things where governments are trying to prevent churches from meeting, essentially, and some of them went obviously way overboard.
Sure.
I mean, they went beyond even the time, manner, place thing. The courts and the states are gonna have a hard time dealing with this. I think we don't have a hard time dealing with it because we base ultimately our view of the church on Scripture and not on the fallible U.S. Supreme Court, which says one thing one year and another thing next year, and all kinds of stuff is mixed up in there.
Yeah, and I was going to say
there might be eventually a more solid basis in the First Amendment, or a more solid interpretation, I guess, of the First Amendment, which would protect churches even more. To some extent, they do have that, in the sense that the general applicability thing, won't allow governments to pick and choose. It has to be generally applicable. It has to be all across the board. But then you get into the problem is if they are generally applicable, then according to that particular rule, the church is just another institution. That's the way they look at it.
Which, to me, it seems like the First Amendment religious clause means we're not just another institution, right? I mean, that if I was a lawyer going to the Supreme Court, it's like obviously a church or a synagogue or a mosque is a different entity than anything else, than a restaurant or a store, because because of the clause is there. Now we know that people interpret the Constitution very liberally today, but it's obvious that a church, mosque, synagogue, whatever entity or whatever building or structure that people want to talk about has a special, significant place in our Constitution.
Right. I would argue that too.
Yeah.
But then the problem you have is, well, then how is it that cities and towns can tell the church how they're going to build their church building and what kinds of electrical systems they have to have, and maybe they have to put in a sprinkler system, and I don't know what all. How they can do that if the church is completely separated from the dictates of government?
I would say that they can. Now we're just really talking. I would say they can because there's nowhere, at least for us, there's nowhere in Scripture in the I don't believe there's anywhere in the Quran or any Jewish extra I don't want to say biblical, but any of their progressive writings that they did or that we have that tells us this is how you build your church. If in the Bible it said build your meeting place to look like this, then I would say then we would have an issue with building codes, but we don't. So we can, because again, we could meet in the house. We could, as Dr. Pipa at Greenville says, all I need is a flask of water and a flask of wine and a piece of bread, and I can have church. So I mean, it's anywhere I go, right?
True
I can
enough.
set up shop, right?
True enough.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so it's not
absolutely.
that the building. Yeah.
No,
But I do think that we're protected in how, like, again, some people just given up on worship on Sunday mornings, but my understanding and our church would argue if we were put in that position, we're commanded to meet together publicly on Sunday mornings. And so therefore we will continue to do that until you make us do it in jail. So I don't know.
and I would do that too. But
Yeah.
here's the problem that some courts might have. I don't know if this particular Supreme Court would have the problem, but here's the problem that some courts would or the obstacle that some courts would throw up. They would say, well, that's what your Bible says about the
Right.
church. But we don't see that uniformly across all religions, and we're not going to protect any one religion anymore, i.e. Christianity, which seemed to be what originally they had in mind way back in the 1700s because there was hardly anything else. But we're not going to do that anymore.
Yeah.
So unless you can show us a general religious command across the board where you must come to worship, you must be allowed to worship, you're just one particular religion, and we're not going to give you that much weight. They might say that. Now, I hope they don't say that, but they might say that because they're not in the business of distinguishing anymore. Back in the 1800s, the Supreme Court made a famous decision, late 1800s, 1879, I believe it was, about polygamy in Utah, in the Utah territory. It was a territory at the time. And the Supreme Court didn't pull any punches at all. They said, this is immoral. This is opposed to the Christian religion and Christian traditions and so on and so on and so on. You wouldn't find a Supreme Court decision that used that kind of language ever today.
Yeah.
And it's sad, but you wouldn't.
Well, and didn't they just make polygamy legal in Utah? I think they might have.
They lessened the penalty.
Okay.
They did that. They lowered the penalty for polygamy, which, essentially encourages people to do it because the penalty is going to be very low.
Let me switch the gears a little bit, but it's related to several things that you've said. Are you familiar with Cantwell v. Connecticut, the Supreme Court case?
Heard of it? Yep.
It's Jehovah's Witnesses that were practicing. I don't know if they were. I should know better since I'm asking you about it, but I think they were just out in the streets. They were doing whatever, evangelizing from their perspective, and they fought whatever occurred. They fought that they were being told they couldn't do it, and so the Supreme Court ruled, and this is something that I was been interested in, that the states could not discriminate against the freedom of religion clause. So it kind of goes against. There's been a lot of these arguments of letting the states go in and make these decisions for their areas versus the federal government. And again, trust me, I'm conflicted because I like less federal government as well. But the federal government, the Supreme Court said, you're not allowed to override the First Amendment freedom of religion
Right.
at the state or local level. So that to me answers some of the issues about, them doing it on a state level versus doing it at a federal level as well.
It does. It does to some degree, but you still got this whole time, manner, place thing hanging over.
Sure.
And they cannot, which is the saving grace, I guess, if you will, of even time, manner, place restrictions. They cannot absolutely deny free exercise of religion, because in that case they would be going to content of what you're doing instead of the way in which you do it.
Sure.
So they can't, just because you have a church that has really, really loud music and
Sure.
neighbors right next door, and they tell you to stop that, you have to tone that down. That doesn't mean they can stop from meeting altogether. It only means they could conceivably tell you have to tone the sound down.
Right.
So as not to disturb the neighbors. That would be what they would call a reasonable time, manner, place restriction.
Sure.
So do these coronavirus regulations fall into that time, manner, place thing?
Sure.
From the Supreme Court's perspective, I don't know, because I've never ruled on it. From my perspective, it might be a good time to bring a good case to the Supreme Court, for the Supreme Court to say, no, you can't just tell people they cannot meet at all. You might be able to tell them, you might be able to say they have to use sanitizing wipes or wipe down the seats or something like that, maybe. But that you can't just tell them you can't meet.
Well, didn't the Supreme Court rule on that like last week for some churches out in California? I believe that said that the state could continue to tell them they couldn't meet. I'm trying to.
They did let the lower court ruling stand.
Yeah.
But I don't put much stock in that. I do think it's a little bit disconcerting.
Yeah.
But that was one federal district court decision, and they let that decision stand. I think you're going to see more challenges that are going to percolate through the system, and you're going to see circuit courts that differ. And whenever the circuit courts differ, that's when the Supreme Court will take a case, because they'll say, well, we can't allow this chaos. We can't allow one circuit to say one thing, another circuit to say another thing. We've got to decide.
Yeah.
I think it'll happen. So, and I think that's good, because we want to at least hear what the Supreme Court's going to say for the next virus that comes along. I sure hope we don't react the way we've reacted this time to the next virus, or we'll be forever wearing masks and gloves and using wipes and everything.
Well, I think I'm afraid they've cried wolf for too long now, because being cautious at first was fine, but now, to continue, again, in our state, honestly, I don't even know what the exact restrictions are anymore. because Nebraska, I don't know if you're familiar, we were one of the last to ever really, make any. We had suggestions, I guess you would say, for a long time, and
Right.
then we had some mandates for about 4 weeks, and then they went back to suggestions or lessened mandates, and so we're still. But I mean, everything is pretty much running pretty normally out here in western Nebraska.
It's
Which is
similar in Tennessee. It's
yeah,
a little bit more restrictive on paper, but
right.
there's even a legal question, and this is also percolating through the judicial system on the state level in a lot of states. There's a legal question as to whether governors can, on their own authority, order all these things.
Well, that's where we were going next, Kevin.
Yeah, yeah,
For
well, that's
sure.
it.
Because the executive branch, again, it's ridiculous to me, and I just the lack of understanding of our government, which is that the legislative branch makes laws, the executive branch enforces the law that the legislative branch has made.
Right.
The loophole that I've seen, and maybe is that there have been states, some of them, where the legislation has given, like, the state health department this power in certain situations. Because, like, in our state, the governor wasn't. He would make some suggestions, but, like, the parks got closed, the state parks got closed, but he didn't close them. The state park department closed them. So when
Right.
people wanted to open back up, he'd go, "Well, I've got nothing to do with that. That's the state." And so everybody complained that afternoon. The state parks were open back up. But so, I mean, and that's been, I think that's been the loophole maybe in some states where the governor is enforcing what the health department has given out because the legislation may or may not have given them that power at some point. That's the conspiracy theory behind FEMA, that someday they could take over because they've been given so much emergency power that it's too much emergency power.
Yeah.
I don't know. You have any further
The
thoughts?
whole emergency power doctrine, which has grown quite a bit over the last, I'd say probably over the last 50 years, is kind of hanging around out there, not just on the state level. And I've seen a lot of governors invoke emergency powers, but on the federal level too. And the Constitution of the United States, to my knowledge, the constitutions of all 50 states as well, do not have emergency power clauses which allow the executive to do whatever he or she wants to do, at least without any legislative authority to back it up.
Right.
And I think too, when you've got state agencies involved in it, it's a little bit disingenuous for a governor, who is, after all, the head of the executive branch, including all the state agencies, to kind of throw it off on the state agencies and say, well, it's their fault. And I guess in the case of the parks out there, he made it clear that he could override what they did because he is the head of the agencies. He's the head of the executive branch, and the agencies are part of the executive branch. And it's very dubious whether these agencies have the kind of emergency powers that the governors are claiming to have. Very dubious. So I think you're already seeing a bunch of cases that have been filed in various states, and they're kind of making their way up through the system. It may take a while to do anything. They may become moot. They may get thrown out because, oh, the situation's not there anymore. You don't have to worry about that. But they're coming up. It's
Right.
the whole executive prerogative that has contained in it the Latin word for king, where the rogative part comes from, which the original Latin word would be rex. That's where that comes from, prerogative. executive prerogative. That whole issue has been brought up over the past few decades, and presidents and governors, I think, are taking more and more upon themselves, and I think it's a bit disturbing, really, to be honest.
Right.
Even when executives do it for good things, it could still come back to bite you later on.
Well, let me complicate things a little bit, because and again, when this all started, I was just living my little Christian pastor's life, and I think about these things occasionally, partially because I know you, and I mean, I've always been. I should be careful. Maybe like I enjoy reading about the War of Northern Aggression. Got a lot of books on it because I'm a good Southerner, but you know, but to complicate it, here's been my thought process. And part of this is, pastors, we need to do what, the government says, the king, Romans 13. When Paul wrote this, they were run by a dictator, those kinds of comments and all those things. But my response is, but we live in a democratic republic. We don't have a king. Or let me say, we do have a king, but our king is not the president.
Right.
Our king is not the Supreme Court. Our king is not the legislature. Those three things are put in place to manage our king. And I would say our king is the Constitution, because we joined together, 13 colonies got together. They put a constitution together. Actually, the history of that's a little bit, first we had the Articles of Confederation. People don't even know that. But we, they put this constitution together saying this is how we will be tied together as states. And, George Washington would show up for a few weeks or months or whatever, and they'd make some decisions, and then he'd go back to the farm, right? We didn't have this. Now, things have developed, of course, where we have to have more constant, I don't want to use the word control, but constant observation in our country. But the king really is the Constitution. And so when people tell me I need to do what the government tells me to do, my response is, well, I guess I need to keep having church so that they'll come and charge me with something so that I can appeal to the king, who is the Constitution. It's not the president. And the Supreme Court is actually becoming the king, because that's who we would appeal to, right? But it's like that's the Constitution is the king, and I believe the interpretation of what the king has said. This gets very spiritual in a sense that we're looking at the words of a document as the Christian does the Bible, right? And so we're looking at the words of this document going, the document tells me what I was arguing. I have freedom of religion to I've lost the word, express my religion.
Exercise of religion.
Yeah, exercise my religion, and which for me tells me we assemble together every week that the elders are called. So do you have any thoughts? Has anybody come across that before, where it's like our king is actually the Constitution, not the president or the Speaker of the House or
the Constitution itself says that it is the supreme law of the land.
Right.
Not the Congress, not the Supreme Court. The problem is that over the past 200 plus years, we have come up with two constitutions. The one is the document itself. The other is all of this collection of Supreme Court interpretations of the document. And most people, unfortunately, pay attention to the interpretations made by the Supreme Court, which really are only their opinions, technically, about what the interpretation is. They pay attention to that and not the document itself. So what do we, what's the answer to that? Well, the answer to that partly is the checks and balances system that we have, if the states would be a little more proactive and say to the federal government, well, this is not in the Constitution. I don't care what the Supreme Court says. It's not in the Constitution itself. You can't make us do that. Then maybe the federal government would have to back off on most things. I don't think they would send in federal troops. Uh, but the states could be more proactive. But on the other hand, you've got individuals who have to be willing to challenge the state or the federal government, either one, using the Constitution itself, not what the Supreme Court says about the Constitution. You're challenging the government on the basis of the Constitution so that you can get a hearing through the judicial system, hopefully to the U.S. Supreme Court, so people will pay attention. And hopefully the Supreme Court will rule your way. It doesn't necessarily mean they will, and it doesn't necessarily mean they'll be right if they don't. But there we have it. We've ended up over time with two constitutions, just like the Jewish people ended up with two laws.
Right.
The law of the Old Testament in the Old Testament, and then all the other interpretations of the laws.
The rabbinic law.
Yeah. Rabbinic law over time. The problem there is human beings. We seem to have a desire to take what is simple and straightforward and uncomplicated and complicated, usually in order to bring about a result that we already have decided we want.
Right.
And that's the history of much of the Supreme Court, certainly in the 20th century and the 21st century.
Well, it's just the history of the world, right?
The history of the world, too, yeah.
Human beings just messing things up.
Yep.
Well, let's switch gears again, but it'll always come back to the Constitution and everything else. And as you mentioned earlier, before we came on, I think like there's issues that have come up since I first asked you if you come on. Number one being this horrendous death, murder, homicide, as it's been labeled by two separate autopsies now, George Floyd up in Minnesota.
And it is a homicide. Technically, it is a homicide. It's just a question of kind of homicide.
Correct. And and I think the autopsy said now that they've ruled it was the pressure to the neck and the back or something like that. I don't want to get it wrong, but that caused a lack of blood to be able to get to the brain, which then caused the death. Right. And again, I just want to be clear that is, it's a horrible, tragic thing that happened. I haven't even been able to watch the video. I saw very little bit of it, and I just couldn't keep going because I can't. I mean, I should watch it, right, if I want to speak to it to some degree. But just from what I saw, to continue to keep somebody in a position like that when they're asking, I can't breathe. But I know that I would be asking God for forgiveness for what would be going through my heart if that had been somebody in my family, that had happened to. I don't care what they had done. They're on the ground. They're handcuffed. They're not going anywhere.
Yeah, apparently this was a very low level sort of thing, and
right.
I've seen several former policemen question, why in the world is this policeman doing that in the first place?
Yeah,
handcuffed. He's on the ground. What do you want?
Well, and there's some indication that they might have known each other, worked together, or something before. Yeah, and again, I don't want to put stuff out there if it's just totally erroneous, but
security at a nightclub.
Yeah, something
That's
like
true.
that. But I haven't seen a lot of talk about that. But
I don't know what that means, but it's true.
Yeah, other than they knew each other, which
right.
Yeah. So anyhow, but now in response to that, we have what we were already talking about to some degree. We have the right to peacefully assemble,
Right.
but that's not what's always happening. We've got
No.
the riots, we've got the burning, we've got the vandalism, and I don't know. Do you want to generally speak to that, or do you want me to talk
Yeah.
some more?
Let me go ahead and talk and say
Yeah,
things, and then you can jump in.
yeah,
First of all, the original incident, I've seen that, and I've seen it described also by a number of people. There seems to be little doubt. Now, legally speaking, this guy, this policeman, this former policeman, is innocent until proven guilty. That's true. There, just from what I've seen and read, there doesn't seem to be much doubt that he did something wrong, and he will be charged and tried for some kind of homicide. Will it be first degree murder? Most of the legal experts I've seen, and I sort of concluded this myself before, say that that's highly unlikely because you'd have to prove malice aforethought, intent, uh, premeditation. There are all kinds of things there that you'd have to prove. Maybe there is something back in the background there that we don't know about that would give rise to that. But I doubt it's going to be first degree murder. It could be something just slightly less than that, which it seems to me more likely. So, that having been said, I think too that one of the lessons that needs to be learned from this is that policemen need to be more careful. Now, is there proof that this has happened? This is happening all over the country in a widespread sort of way? Actually, there isn't that much proof. I saw the Washington Post published statistics that showed that there were only 41 incidents of deaths under the custody of the police without a weapon, where the person didn't have a weapon. 41 incidents in 2019, 19 of which involved individuals who were white, 9 who were African American, and 9 Hispanic. Now, that is a little bit higher for the African American and Hispanic than the population proportions are. But 41 incidents in the whole country in 2019 doesn't indicate that there's some widespread systemic, and that's the term that you hear a lot about, systemic racism in the police and the population in general. There was something wrong with what that policeman did in that case. No question about that. At least from what everybody has seen,
right.
there doesn't be any question about that at all. Now, peaceable assembly to protest that or to call for justice in that case, yeah, that's understandable. A lot of people want to see justice done. I think the state of Minnesota and very possibly the Justice Department, although they may take a second seat to the state first, state prosecutions, because the Justice Department can't just bring a murder charge. They have to bring a civil rights violation case. So they'll let the state go first, some kind of homicide charge, and then they'll kind of wait and see and see what they do next. I have no doubt. I really have no doubt, or little doubt anyway, that justice will be done. Yeah, you never know what's going to happen. Everybody's entitled to a jury of your peers.
Right.
I have no idea what that jury, and the guy's probably going to ask for a jury trial. I would if I were in his situation, unless I were just completely repentant and decided I'm giving in. You know, he'd probably want a jury trial. I don't know what the jury's going to say in the end, so I could end up being wrong. But if in a jury trial he ends up being exonerated, the federal government can step in with civil rights charges, so they can be a secondary mechanism. Then you have the tertiary issue of the violence, the looting, the destruction, the vandalism, and all that. Well, that's pretty clear that that is not within the purview of the freedom of assembly. That and that falls outside the original meaning of freedom of assembly, for one thing, and it certainly would not fall within protection from the unreasonable time, manner, place restrictions, if you will, that various states might have. So either way you slice it, the violence, the vandalism, the destruction, and so on and so forth, the looting is not protected. So the question is, what do you do about it? That seems to be the real dilemma right now. There aren't enough policemen in most of these cities to do it. Some of the cities, some of the states have called in the National Guard, a certain number of National Guardsmen. Washington, D.C. is a little bit of an exceptional case because the federal government technically can govern D.C. any way it wants to. It's a federal district. So, and they've called out all kinds of people, you know, FBI, Secret Service, DEA, Homeland Security, National Guard. They can call out the military, in fact, although the president does have a limited right under the Constitution, the language of the Constitution, to actually call out the regular army in cases of insurrection. But that's not something you want to make it you're doing. It's usually the National Guard. The last case I can remember, and I may be wrong about this, of a president actually sending in federal troops, regular army troops, was when Eisenhower sent troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, to desegregate the high school there. That would have been about 1959 or 1960. I can't remember. 1959, I think it was. Those were regular army troops. Those were guys who had served in World War II in Europe, in Germany. Let's just say the state authorities were a little bit intimidated by Eisenhower doing that. But that's kind of rare. But it, at least according to what the Constitution says, it can be done under certain circumstances. You have to figure out whether these are the right circumstances or not. And, you know, knowing executive authority like it's evolved, I don't think it matters who the president is right now. He would interpret that authority pretty broadly if he wants to. In other words, he'd see the word insurrection. Oh, yeah, it's an insurrection. Sure. Whether it is or not. But National Guardsmen are usually the ones who are called in situations like that. And they can be controlled by the state governments too, which is what's happening, I think, so far in a few states. What, 12 states, I believe?
Yeah, I think that's right.
There are all kinds of things that pop into my head here, but maybe you should say something here.
Well, no, I was gonna ask. I don't know that there's an answer. That's why I'm asking you. It seems to me like we would want to stop the people. And again, they are arresting people. They're trying to keep people from doing things.
It's just hard.
I think yeah. But I mean, there was even a video that it was a peaceful protester on a cell phone, on her cell phone, an African American woman, young lady, on a cell phone taking video of two women, hooded, COVID mask. So you can't really, I couldn't tell you who they were, what, race they were, ethnicity. They were of an olive colored, skinned people, but they were spray painting a Starbucks, Black Lives Matter and all this. And the African American woman with the cell phone was like, please stop doing this. They're going to blame us. We're not doing this. We're peacefully protesting. get out of here. And then they responded by saying, we're your they were using the word comrade, right? We're the
Uh-oh.
black comrades, we're your allies.
Uh-oh.
Like,
If
we
we
don't want you to
comrade,
do it. Yeah. And so that's pretty much their Antifa. But I mean, so how do we, I mean, I guess, I mean, you don't have the answer, but what do we, I don't know. I'm just talking now. It feels like we should be able to do more to stop the people that are actually doing this stuff. I wish we were able to do it.
well, I think the president has been right about at least a couple things that I've heard him say a lot the past few days.
Sure.
All this violence is submerging the basic message, the underlying message that,
Right.
that there's a perceived injustice that has been done to Mr. Floyd, and that needs to be dealt with and corrected through the judicial system, but the violent protesters have submerged that message. And the other thing he said, and I think he's onto something here, is that a lot of these mayors and governors have not been very proactive. They've not been very firm, I guess you could say, in wanting to maintain the rule of law in their cities. Because, and I heard one African American attorney, a former policeman, who was interviewed on one of the news networks, say this. He said, because he said they're afraid of losing the vote.
Right.
And the vote of various minorities or whatever.
Sure.
I don't think so. I think that the vast majority of whatever groups live in these cities, they want law and order too.
Yeah.
They have businesses there, they have jobs there, they have lives and houses there, and relatives and so on and so forth. And they want protection too from these thugs, wherever they're from. I don't know where they're from.
Right.
I'm not going to speculate where they're from, but wherever they're from, they do seem to have an agenda that's very different from the, we really want justice. We really want this wrong rectified. They seem to have a different agenda. I mean, I was reading something and I think it was correct. It was on another reputable news network that pointed out some protesters who were looting stores in Beverly Hills, California.
Yeah.
And one of them was overheard chanting, "Eat the rich." And I'm thinking, eat the rich. What does that have to do with Mr. Floyd? What does that have to do with his problem, his issue?
Right.
All that was done to him, the injustice that was done. What is that? And the answer is, it doesn't have anything to do with it. These people, I think, are mostly Marxists. They may not be members of Antifa. They may not be members of any organization at all. But it seems to me they have the marks of Marxists.
Yeah.
Cultural Marxists, as one sociologist has labeled them.
So I'm using the past tense, correct me if I'm wrong, you were a ruling elder for many years. What are your thoughts from that perspective on any of the topics, really? I mean, you can talk about, again, the church closures or sanctions, or I shouldn't say sanctions, there were sanctions, guidelines that affected the church, or this case. I mean, what's a good response, do you think, from the part of the church as it relates to, or you can pick either one or both, but just to the church guidelines, the George Floyd situation? What do you think is a good response from the church?
Well, I think on the church regulations or the church closures, the first thing we would need to do is to be in agreement as a group of elders in Presbyterianism, we would call it a session.
Right.
Be in agreement that this is what Scripture says about the authorities and about the church and about the ability of the civil authorities to regulate the church and so on and so forth. And I'm assuming that we're going to conclude that the civil authority has limited power over the church. Some, yeah, in terms of things like building codes and maybe, electrical systems and things like that. Um, but meeting together as Scripture commands us, because that's a higher command from God than the governor saying you can't meet. I'm assuming that's going to be our conclusion. And, there are going to be people in the church who are going to disagree with that too. They're going to say, oh, but you need to pay attention to the dangers of this virus. That's a legitimate argument. We have to pay attention to that too. The fears that people have in the church of maintaining it. I think the answer is easy. I think it is. Now, maybe it isn't, but I think it is. You open the church. Those who want to come. Those who really are fearful, perhaps legitimately, perhaps not. Those who don't want to come, don't come until they believe that it's safe. It's truly safe to come. I think that's an area where you can't in my opinion, you can't discipline, you can't condemn them for being fearful of getting the virus. If we all get together, a whole bunch of us get together, they may not be correct about that, but there's all kinds of information floating around out there, and the information is sometimes conflicting, and I don't even know what it all is sometimes. So on that, I would assume that we would decide to open up, but give people the freedom to stay home until they think it's safe to attend, and make sure that you keep things clean and you don't unnecessarily open the possibility of spreading germs and so on and so forth. That's pretty basic stuff. Cleanliness. As far as George Floyd, I think the most important, and I don't know that a church needs to make some kind of formal declaration about it, but I think the most important thing for us to remember as Christians is two things, really. God does want justice on the part of civil authorities. He does not want civil authorities to act lawlessly. And sometimes they will. He does not want civil authorities to behave lawlessly. But on the other hand, I think we need to understand that biblically, there's no such thing as systemic racism. There's systemic sin. There's, if you want to call it that, quote unquote, there's systemic sin. We're all sinners, and we all manifest our sins in different ways at different times under different circumstances. But systemic racism is this notion that basically it's this notion that all policemen, all government authorities, and some people would even go so far as to say all white people are just racists. And I dispute that. I dispute that. But we are all sinners. And so we can sin in various ways. And we have to be careful about that. And we have to just, when we come to those passages, we have to preach that the civil authority is there to punish evil, not there to behave lawlessly. And sin is in all of us, but it doesn't have the same form in all of us.
You're familiar with Bodie Baucham, right?
Yes.
He and I actually just posted this the other day, and I don't know how many years ago he coined this phrase, but he called it ethnic Gnosticism. And James White picked up on it, and then there was some back and forth. I don't know, but he preached again about it about a year ago, I think. And it's just the idea that basically, that it's that there is this systemic racism, and you and I can't see it. But they, being any other race, they know, any other ethnicity, they know when you have spoken hatefully towards them. And if you say, well, that's not what I meant, they can say, it's because you don't know. And so we're just in a no-win situation because we don't know what we don't know, right? They know,
It's true.
they know that we're being racist, but we don't know what we don't know. And he's calling that ethnic Gnosticism. And you can't fight that. You literally can't fight it because that's, we don't know what we don't know. What are we to do? So, no,
Well,
I appreciate
you know,
what you're saying.
yeah, I
There.
think if we hold the civil authorities to their duty of doing justice
Yeah.
in individual cases, because group guilt is a dangerous thing. Group guilt for anybody.
Yeah.
In a time when a lot of white people did hate a lot of black people because of the group they were part of. That was very bad. Now you've got some who are arguing systemic racism who are basically arguing all white people are bad.
Yeah.
And the Marxists or the communists argue that all capitalists were bad. And the Nazis argued that all Jews were bad. And this group guilt thing is not biblical.
Right. And the thing is too, it's if we say there's no systemic racism, that doesn't mean we're saying that there are no racists out there.
Right.
I know racists. I know racist people, but that doesn't mean the system is rigged.
Right.
And I don't feel like it was rigged in my favor. But of course, I don't know because I don't know. But I'm being facetious. But it's just yeah. I mean, I know racists. So anybody that's listening, I'm sure Kevin probably has known racists in his life. We're not saying there are not racists. We're saying there's not systemic racism, which we could do a whole other show about.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's a one by one, day by day fight just for people to see who you are as a person. I mean, just to say that there's systemic racism really does put this impossible burden on somebody like myself or yourself. I mean, there's no way I can prove to you anything that I'm not, that you're not, he's not, if you're just going to put that blanket statement out there.
If there were systemic racism, then the state of Minnesota would not be prosecuting this policeman.
Right. Well, and that does bring up an interesting point, though. And I don't remember his name, but the black gentleman that was murdered down in Georgia.
Yep.
They weren't getting prosecuted until it became a thing.
Yep.
And again, we might say a little bit more about Georgia than we might Minnesota, but we don't know, so we can't say. But there's definitely some fishy stuff going on in that department down there, which again could be, I guess, I don't know, I don't want to call it systemic racism, but there could have been one too many racists down there, or one too many people simply trying to protect their own down there.
Possible. Either one is possible.
Yeah, right. And
that's
so
that's where you have to have, even on the state level, a system of checks and balances, where in this case, as I recall, the state now has stepped in, and even the Department of Justice is investigating as well.
Right. But as you said, that doesn't mean we're sitting around in rooms smoking cigars and trying to figure out how to put people in the right place. People are wicked. We believe in total depravity. So you're gonna get pockets of wickedness all over the place, and
Sure.
all we can do is continue to fight it, battle by battle, day by day, ultimately knowing that Christ is the one that's going to overcome all of this. And so for us just to seek justice, right? for the folks when it comes to our attention. That was the thing that we didn't say at the beginning as well that I wanted to say. The reason why this George Floyd thing is such a big thing, I think, as well, is because I guess there's 10 minutes of him there on the ground
Yeah.
that, just at any point, if you would have let off of this man, let off of his neck, he could have survived. But for that, for it to go on that long and for us to see it, it doesn't matter black, white, yellow, red, I
Right.
can't remember, I can't remember the old song, but it doesn't matter the color. This just shouldn't happen to anyone. And so
No, it was incredible. I couldn't, I still can't understand intellectually
right.
why that policeman would be doing that. I just don't. But who knows what will come out in the trial? There will be a trial. That's a good thing. There will be a trial.
I can only think that, and again, this is probably beyond doing, but I mean, it's just there's something wrong with that man, because it doesn't matter what George Floyd had done or said or whatever. He was immobilized, and there was no need to continue with doing what he did. And I guess, and the people were calling out to him. The EMTs wanted to check for a pulse, and they wouldn't let them do it. There's some darkness there that it's disturbing. It's disturbing.
And the guy apparently was detained for passing a bad check.
Right.
And he was already handcuffed and on the ground.
Yeah.
What is going on here? I don't know. I can't fathom it.
And to take it back to the Constitution, I mean, I'm sure, and many police departments across the nation have made gestures of repentance and forgiveness, because they're apologetic that kind of thing happened. I've heard a couple of cases where they showed the video in police precincts and said, this is not what you do, right? So it's a learning tool. I mean, that's a good thing that would come out of that. You do not do this.
Right.
And I forget where I was going with all that, but yeah, it's just, it's the constitutionality of it. The police have to do, and I don't want to say a better job, because again, the numbers aren't out of control of this kind of thing happening, as you pointed out, I believe. But the police have always got to be vigilant to police themselves.
Right.
Because they are the front line of guarding our constitutional rights. I don't know that they're taught that. I don't know that they think of it that way. But for me,
right. They are. Today they are.
They're taught that.
In the modern age, they are. Okay. They are the Constitution. They're taught Supreme Court's various decisions about the Constitution that relate to due process of law, which is why it seems unfathomable.
But I mean, and I think citizens, right? The citizens need to know that they are the front line of defense for our constitutional rights. I've had a couple of conversations since all this started with people within law enforcement, and they themselves, again, I don't know, I don't want to say too much, but I mean, it's just, enforcing some things that the government might have been wanting to enforce, they would have been very hesitant to do because they didn't believe it was constitutional. Mm-hmm. And so they were willing to take that step as well, to go, I'm not going to, if I'm called upon to do certain things, I'm not going to do certain things, and then I will face the consequences. And then we'll see, again, we have to appeal to our king, which is the Constitution, through the court system, to say, is this actually legitimate for these people to be asking me to do? And again, that's the way our government works. And I'm sometimes we don't think of it that it can be a long process, but appealing to our king really is going through the court system to get the.
I do think you've raised one issue that we haven't said much about. We don't have to say about it, but raised the very distinct possibility that the vast majority of people today haven't been taught anything about our system at all, about our constitutional constitutional system or about the Constitution itself.
Or they've been taught incorrectly.
They've been taught incorrectly.
Yeah.
They don't know the principles of our founding, which would have wanted to avoid these sorts of things. Well, there's just an abysmal lack of knowledge in the general public and in the education system of our governmental system and our constitutional system and the Constitution itself.
So what do we do about that?
Well, I mean, the answer is to teach it,
Yeah.
but that's a simple answer. How do you actually implement that?
They come to Bryan College and they
Some of
learn
us
from
try.
Kevin Clauson.
Yes, some of us try.
So we can point them in that direction. So they come to Bryan College in Dayton, Tennessee, and they take a class on government. What we can kind of start wrapping it up this way. What classes are you teaching there at Bryan College?
Well, let's see. I teach most everything in government: constitutional law, state and local government, international relations, jurisprudence or philosophy of law, political economy and public policy, American government, sort of the general course in American government, and then a much more general course still, society, economics, and government, which is a combination of constitutional government and free enterprise economics. So I teach a bunch of stuff.
And there is a word escaping me. There is you're overseeing some sort of
oh yes, the Center for Faith, Freedom, and the Constitution.
Center for Faith, Freedom, and Constitution. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's part of Bryan College, but it would be considered a kind of like a think tank, like the Heritage Foundation, for example, except much, much smaller than the Heritage Foundation. And our goal is to try to educate the Bryan College community and, to the extent possible, the larger community in issues pertaining to our constitutional system and free enterprise economics, liberty and justice. So we bring in speakers occasionally and try to do some other things. I solicit donations to the center. Sometimes we can't bring in speakers unless we have money. So,
all right.
Some speakers will come in for free, but some will not.
Does that have its own website, or is that just through Bryan College?
No, it's just through Bryan College. Well, it has a site, but it's through Bryan College.
Okay.
It's a subheading.
Well, let's pull that up for everybody.
Center for Faith, Freedom, and the Constitution. Now, we may need to do some work on the website.
That's all right. So here we go. This is where Dr. Clauson teaches at Bryan College.
There's parts of the campus. You can see activities, things going on.
And so what's the easiest way to get to you? This is why I should have pulled this up beforehand.
Pull up, the easiest way to get to me is pull up academics, and then under academics, faculty.
We've got faculty here.
You can go by major too, politics and government. Faculty, but you got faculty and staff. Somewhere down there, you've got faculty and staff.
Somewhere we've got it.
Go back to academics.
Well, that's where I'm at now. Now we look like we don't know what we're doing.
Wait, go back up. Go back up. Back up. Back. Now, stop.
Yep.
Right there where it says faculty.
Yeah.
And over here, you'll find faculty.
We got it.
And there I am.
All right. Took a second, but we're here. All right. So there's the Center for Faith, Freedom, and the Constitution, Professor of Government Law. Got your credentials, professional activities, topics of expertise, which is where I knew about Oliver Cromwell. If anybody's interested in Oliver Cromwell, that movie is actually on Amazon Prime right now. So you can watch, yes, you can watch Cromwell on Amazon Prime for free right now today.
Wow. I didn't know.
Yeah. Do you have Amazon Prime?
Yes, I do. But I have 3 copies of it. So,
and who's the star? The famous actor.
Richard Harris.
Richard Harris. There you go.
Harris, who is probably known to most people as Dumbledore, the first Dumbledore.
Yeah.
Movies.
I hadn't even thought about that. The last time I saw Oliver Cromwell, I watched it with you, by the way. So
yes,
you probably don't remember that.
I don't, but I've watched it many times.
But is there a link to the Center for Faith, Freedom, and the Constitution in here?
Well, I'd have to delve into that.
All right.
I'm not sure.
I can. They can get. Let me do. They can get in touch with you, kevin.clauson@bryan.edu. There's a phone number. Again, just go to.
That's it.
Go to this website and we're going to check real quick and see if that ought to get it for us if there is something. There it is.
There we are. So we just kind of scroll down there and let's see.
Vision, religious liberty.
There it is.
Learn more about politics government here.
Little blurb. There's a statue of William Jennings Bryan.
Who the college is named after. We didn't mention that.
Yes. Who ran for president 3 times, got the nomination for the Democratic Party 3 times, and lost 3 times. But he was perseverant.
Yes. And of course, the Scopes trial, which
yes,
he's probably more known for amongst most people.
Yeah.
Yep.
What most people don't know is that after he got out of politics, but before the Scopes trial, he traveled all across the country, giving speeches, speaking to large groups, camps in the summertime about the gospel. The gospel.
Right.
That's what he did.
He was considered a great orator.
Right? Yes, he was. Yes, he was.
All right. Well, I don't want to keep you any longer. So any thoughts you have at the end here, anything we left off regarding the Constitution or what's been going on that you want to share with anyone?
Well, I appreciate being here. Appreciate you having me. See all my books back here.
Oh, yeah, it's great. And I'm assuming that's at your house.
That's my house, my study.
Yeah, which I've been there. Is that Blueberry Hill?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I remember. I don't know why I remember. And so are you guys going to be open this fall? I mean, y'all have plans to just.
That's the plan. That's the plan.
To be open. Very good. All right. Well, again, we do thank you. Thank you very much for being with us and sharing your thoughts on just some of the stuff that's been going on from a constitutional perspective. And so for everybody else, we look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great evening. God bless.
Thank you.